So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Felt. And incidentally, for those of you that do know me, my name is still Chris Felt. So I'd just like to break the ice by being corny there. I'm going to be talking about a larger period of history than I intended on it. Originally, when I approached the Historical Society, it was just before COVID hit. And I was going to cover the period from 1804 through 1970. So the start of the Federal Road through the start of Bentry, because this was more originally a Bentry-centric kind of history area. And then he wrote this book that came out and said, hey, let's start with the Federal Road. So I was thinking I'm going to go back a little further. I'm going to go back to the Cherokee War in the 1700s and start there, because it really dovetails into Andrew Pickens and why we're Pickens County, and why Long Swamp is so important to us here in the county, history-wise. And I think I'll begin there. So if you can go to my first slide. This is just kind of a timeline. I don't know if you guys can see this. It says Treaty of Long Swamp is the first item, 1782, which is true. But prior to that, 1779, the very, very first mention of any kind of physical place, I should say, apart from Fernando de Soto's literature in Spanish from 1540 when he came through Talking Rock. Apart from that, the very next mention in 1779 was in a private letter. Andrew Pickens, he chased a group of Cherokee with 160 men to Sharp Mountain. So not Sharp Top, but Sharp Mountain on the other side of 515 off of Highway 53 by Hill City. And he routed out a group of 300 Cherokee. They were chasing the British agent, a guy by the name of Alexander Cameron, who had been tipped off, so he fled. But they destroyed the village there, probably the one near Murphy Bottoms off of Jerusalem Church Road, for those of you that are familiar. Subsequently, another couple of skirmishes, they rolled through, Cameron did, and they wiped out about 50,000 bushels of corn in 12 villages. And finally, in 1782, the Treaty of Long Swamp happened after Andrew Pickens and his guys came through and destroyed a bunch of Cherokees in ball ground at the confluence of the Etowah and Long Swamp Creek. That's where the village site is. So if you're ever in ball ground and you drive through town past, I guess it's the name of the Wheeler House, is that on the left? Go down 2 miles past that, you'll get to 372. You'll be at the bridge of the Etowah River. Right on the north side of the river there, that's where Long Swamp was. That's where the treaty was signed. There were 6 or 7 loyalists to the British that were, they called them Tories back in the day. And they end up hanging 6 of them in Nelson right after that. And after that, the Cherokee were forced to cede a bunch of lands further south. They used the rivers as boundaries. So it was another one of those treaties that the Cherokee were kind of forced into. I'm not going to get into that, and it's beyond the scope of this discussion. But that's really where Long Swamp comes in. That's really why Andrew Pickens is known here. He was a brigadier general at that time from the Revolutionary War. Andrew Pickens was actually born in 1736 in Pennsylvania, in the British Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, because it's about 40 years before our nation started. He grew up as a farmer, and really, he spent 1 year fighting on the side of the British before he figured it out, and later decided to transfer over. And so he was very, very successful, to the point where the Cherokee, and you forgive me, I'm not going to butcher the word in Cherokee, but his nickname was the Wizard Owl. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Now you know why. Okay, so he was the Wizard Owl. I think really the point was he was a brilliant tactician, and he would often fake people out and then flank them with opposing groups and destroy people over and over again. He wasn't much of a talker or a writer, but he was a good fighter, and I didn't mean to rhyme there. Next slide, please. No, just keep going forward. Okay, so I have a map here, if you can even see it. Up here near the upper right, it says Long Swamp Village. Right beneath that, the next one is Hickory Log. So to give you some kind of bearing, if you guys have ever been to the Super Walmart in Canton on Riverstone Parkway, that's the location of Hickory Log. When they were building that Walmart, they excavated the village there. Now, John Coffey the general from Alabama in 1799 in one of his manuscripts said that Long Swamp Village was exactly 11 miles north of Hickory Log. So once I learned where Hickory Log was, being under the Walmart there, and I drove to the site of the Long Swamp Village, you'll be surprised. It's 11 miles still to this day. Exactly. So they were very accurate. 1938, archaeologist for the WPA, a guy by the name of Robert Wauchope, came through, excavated not only Long Swamp Village and Hickory Log, but he went ahead and he found a petroglyph just south of Bentry on the 75 acres that are behind Craft Realty. I've got photos of that, but they're not in this show. I think it's gone now. I've hiked that whole section, and I can't find that rock anywhere. He also found an Indian mound near Sandy Bottoms, and he found an Indian village near Jeep Fest. And these are all in part of his report that came out in 1966. So he started in 1938, and by 1966, he released his findings, and nobody knew about them. But I've got that if anyone's interested in that, looking through those maps or diagrams or artifacts that they found. Next slide, please. So getting back to Gary's takeover of my slideshow, the old Federal Road, on the map here, you see it says Daniels right where the yellow is. Harnages is right next door in between. That's Long Swamp Creek. So when you're driving down the road there, right before you get to the railroad tracks and get to the Tate house, up on the hill up to your right would be where Chief Daniels had his original tavern on the Federal Road. And then where Harnages is, on the left side, that's where the Tate Mansion is. So Andrew Harnage was a tavern keeper also. He was from, I believe he originally immigrated from Massachusetts. So Harnages became the very, very first courthouse and very first county seat for the new Cherokee County, which was very huge when it started in 1832. And what ended up happening is, it was really neat. Andrew Jackson and James Monroe, President Monroe, both passed through there on the Federal Road and even stayed the night in Tate. Andrew Jackson passed through to go to fight in the Seminole War when he was a general and not the president yet. And James Monroe, 5th president, stayed at Harnages overnight. He didn't write much about it, but he stayed there. And he passed on. Next slide, please. So you mentioned this, Gary. Before there was Pickens. So originally there was a Cherokee in a Gilmer County. So Cove Road is kind of the boundary today between the two counties where they merged. So everything kind of almost in Bentry and north all the way up to Ellijay was part of Gilmer at that time. Now, the line's a lot different. Next slide, please. So I'm actually skipping ahead. 1829, I should mention 1828, out near Dawson, Dahlonega, and Aurora, pretty much the first Georgian gold rush happened. So gold was discovered out there, and that was a big, big boon, and that was one of the principal reasons we had the land lottery of 1832, where we divided up the Cherokee territory. And so people would get lots of land, and the really lucky people would be the people that would win gold lots. So those were parcels of land that had gold mines on them. So if you guys have been down Yellow Creek Road to the end, and sometimes some of you have seen the administration building on the other side from the Yellow and Gold Farms down there, that was the site of the Franklin Gold Mine. Franklin Gold Mine was named that after Mary Franklin, who won the land lottery. And it was one of the largest mining operations in North Georgia from about 1832 till 1906, when they accidentally dug under the Etowah River and flooded the gold mine, and some people died. And so that kind of dried that up, even though it's a really bad pun. So my point being is, a lot of the settlers from Ireland, from Scotland, from England, they came here and they learned how to mine gold out in, Dahlonega, out in Aurora, and then all of a sudden they heard about the California gold rush. So there were a lot of, this is pre-Pickens County by about 5 years. There are a lot of people that would later be in Pickens County that left here to go out to the California gold rush. Among them, we had John Hendrix and John Darnell. That's actually John Hendrix and his wife. That's not Mr. Darnell. And another one that was famous was Edward Lenning. And another one was Samuel Bozeman, who Bozeman, Montana is named after. But John Hendrix, John Darnell, they went out there, they hit it really big. They came back several years later with a lot of money, and the rumor had it that they came back and they bought most of the land between Cove Road and Sharptop Mountain for about 25 cents an acre. That's a really great story. But when you look at like the old tax digest back in the record, you'll find out that the Hendrix family, they owned a lot of land, but I don't think they had like 5,000, 7,000 acres. I think they may have had like 600 to 1,000 acres, but you know, everyone likes a good story. Next slide. So this house originally belonged to Henry Fitz. It was built in 1847. This house is still standing in Pickens County. It's about a mile from the front gate of Bentry. Later on, through the deed record, it passed on to the Hendrix family, to the grandson of John Hendrix. And then later on, there were some intermarriages, like everyone knows, between like the Penleys and the Hendrixes and everyone else. But this house is amazing. It's on a 28-acre parcel right outside of a bamboo forest. It recently foreclosed on. I was given permission to go check it out. I didn't go inside because, you know, even though it's standing, I didn't want to get hurt. It's a really magnificent structure. It's about 2,500 square feet. The interior section is just a log cabin, and they built out from there. So the clapboard and stuff and the other stuff, you see the metal roof is all new. It's got an electrical box on the side of it from like 1940. But that's still in our county. That's kind of neat. There's about 6 chimneys there. Next slide. This map is just really kind of showing you the different militia districts. So those of us that live in Bentry mostly live in the Grassy Knob district. There's a few people maybe that live in Sharptop district. This map was drawn up by J.B. Hill. For those of you who know who he is, I think he drew this in 1913. He was a very close worker with Colonel Sam Tate, and really was kind of one of his right-hand guys. Next slide, please. So this map was fun, kind of hard to see. On it, if you can read it, it says Tate Sawmill, Marble Works Quarry, and Gordon's Crossroads. So on the map where it says Tate Sawmill, which is kind of left and down from the 5, that would be right across from Grandview out the back gate of Bentry, across from Penley Creek Stables, about a half mile down off of one of the streets like Songbird on the bank of the river. They used to call it also the Penley Mill, but that's where one of the locations is. When you square up the land lot, because all the land lot numbers are still the same. Next slide, please. Now, for people that don't live in Bentry, you might be worrying or wondering, who is Sally Doss? Why do we care about Sally Doss? There's a chimney that's still standing. It's the only old school chimney standing in Bentry. It's by Lake Tamarack. When I first moved into Bentry, I only knew that Sally Doss had a chimney. And I thought, why does anyone care about Sally Doss? And it was really because she had a chimney. Honestly, no offense. Sally Doss was born Sally Penley. She was the daughter of Alfred Penley. And Sally became a Doss because when she was a little kid, she moved out to Sugar Hill and she fell in love with her boy neighbor, Edward Doss. And he went off and he joined the Civil War. They got married. And 2 years later, he died at Bean Hill, Tennessee of an illness. And his brother died in the same place of an illness. And she remained a widow for the rest of her life. She applied for a pension to the government. I think she was granted like $200, but that's a lot of money in 1870s money. And she came back and bought about 270 acres inside of what now is Bentry. So where the Sally Doss chimney is and most of under Lake Tamarack, that was her property. Next slide, please. So Moonshine Wars. So I think everyone here is probably familiar with the North Georgia history of moonshining. Maybe so with the Honest Men's Friends and Protectors group. That's the guy on the right, one of the Night Riders. The moonshine wars were so brutal here between the tax revenue agents and the government and the Army and everyone and the locals and the informants that the United States Army actually moved in locally. And they had to kind of intervene. There were a bunch of arsons that happened in 1889. A bunch of guys, about 27 of them dressed up like the guy on the right. They had a manifesto. I know that's not a good word today. They filled it out in a hollow out of an oak tree or a walnut tree, And what they had done is they signed their mission statement, but they signed all the names of their enemies as being who they were. So all the people in town that basically were anti-moonshiners, they're like, hey, we're these 27 people in case you find this paper. And so December 3rd, 1889, they left from pretty much where Young Life is today, in between Sharp Top and north of Bentry. And they went out to Jones Mountain Road and they burned down some more houses. And they all eventually, someone ratted on them. And there's a bunch of trials. 7 of them went to jail for life. The rest of them got off scot-free. Names like Whittington and Penley were, involved in the bunch. Lansdowne, one guy and his father were both indicted, and it was a Seaborn Lansdowne and his father, Jack. Jack died in the escape attempt. Seaborn actually made it back to Pickens County, changed his name, and moved out west. So of the 7 people, I think one of them got away. Anyway, but that was kind of interesting. One other thing I should mention, that in 1888, the Posse Comitatus Act was passed by the government, which basically said, the Army, the United States Army specifically, can no longer get involved in civilian affairs. That's because of what happened here in Pickens County, in Dawson County, with all these moonshine wars. They just overstepped their bounds. People were getting killed, and they went too far. Next slide, please. Tornado of 1884, 20 dead. So this cover of the AJC from 1884, if you saw it, it's hard to see, but up there in the corner is Jasper. There was a bunch of tornadoes outbreak in the southeast, and they rolled through, and when they hit our county, they kind of went through Cagletown. I think you know this. They probably killed some of your family. Levi Cagle and some of his children picked up a house and just kind of threw it there through Cagletown. For those of you who aren't familiar where Cagletown is, it's kind of near 108, right?
108 near Bethany Church and all that.
Yeah, out in that section. And it worked its way through there, through what's now Bentry, up through Grassy Knob and over. And I believe it damaged Long Swamp Baptist Church too. Blew it away also. It was a big one. Next slide will show the names of the people that died back in 1884. So we've got some Kegels and Watkinses and Colliers and Dowdas. And there's a Dowda mill that you guys are familiar with. Some children of the Kegels, some Pettits. So it was a big thing. It was a big deal. It made nationwide news. It wasn't just in the AJC. It was a really bad outbreak. Next slide, please. So back to John Darnell. Darnell, did hit it pretty big, and he came back, and they ended up having a Darnell District on, it's pretty much a school region. There was a school, too, like the Penley District there. Next slide. So why are the Whittingtons in this? Okay. So if you can imagine this family out of downtown Atlanta, this guy on the right, Charles Whittington, was the Cuban consul for Atlanta. He decided to take his whole family from downtown Atlanta, put them on a train, go to Tate in Victorian garb with Victorian furniture, and to disembark there at the Tate Depot, which must have been a sight, in 1910. He got in the back of a truck, and he pretty much ended up settling where the 6th hole today of Ventry's golf course is. So you mentioned Lily Mae. Lily Mae Penley, because Lily Mae was born a champion. Her father, Vernie Champion, at the age of about 14, was hired by the Whittingtons to build their house. And he built it. And it had 14 bedrooms. It had about a 4,000 square foot living room. Had a chimney that could hold an 8 or 10 foot log. It had gas lanterns, had a Monarch stove, huge porch, wraparound porch, and it had water that it piped down from Buckskull. But this is, 1910, 1911. This really was a really big and magnificent house. And the reason it's kind of relevant, next slide, please. I'll get to this in a second. It ended up being the location of the Dude Ranch. And then later the CCC camp. And then later, our 6th hole. But this ad here, Charles Whittington was trying to be a land developer, like Sam Tate and some of the others. And read just the top part. Any man paying 8 1/3 cents a day can own a farm. Just 2.5 hours ride from Atlanta. It took a lot longer then. Well, they didn't have the traffic we have today. And he says he's 4,000 feet above sea level, so he's off by about 800 feet. Can't fault him for that. One of the healthiest spots in the world and famous for its apples and poultry. Well, most of the golf course in Bentry was orchards back in the day. And orchards were important because orchards led to moonshining, and moonshining led to money. And so that was good for everybody. He does mention here that he was abutted next to Colonel Sam Tate's 6,000 famous acres. So before Sam Tate really got big, he's still here in 1910 owning 6,000 acres, doing a good job. Next slide, please. Sally Doss, okay, she died single still, from her husband in the Civil War, dies in 1913. Her last census document said she was a widower and a farmer, and she's buried at Long Swamp Baptist Church also. Next slide. That's okay. So Sally Doss was related, I believe, through Clay Paget's wife, who was the Fields by maiden name, to the Paget family. So they end up getting her house. And this is just the kind of the court document showing that they get the house. Next slide, please. This house was Clay Paget's home. This is in, the photos of Pickens' book. A lot of Bentry residents like to think that this is where the Sally Doss chimney is in Bentry, but I assure you it's not. This house was under the lake, right by the street that they misspelled. So there's a street called Paget Court, which was really supposed to be Paget Court. I get it, it's one letter different, but right off the edge of that street, if you drove into Lake Tamarack, you'd be at this house. Not just on the maps, but just period, right? So Clay Paget's house was another one of Sally Doss's 240 acres. She had more than one home, but that's where it was. Next slide, please. Oh, I should mention too also that Mrs. Fields, meaning Clay's wife, her relatives were Tom and Eli Fields, and those were two of the Honest Men's Friend and Protector group too, of the 27. So still related, still having fun, interesting. So the state has this quadrangle drawn up in 1926 where they come by and they do this survey. It's a topographical survey. This map that's out there shows, you can't really see, but the little dots indicate where houses and where churches are and things. So you can actually see on this map, if you're close enough, Clay Paget's dot underneath the lake where it would be today. Next slide, please. Sam Tate. I don't want to belabor this guy. Everyone knows this guy. He looks like, what's his name in Tombstone? I just want to point that out. Next slide, please. So, bad timing. So Colonel Sam Tate, around October of 1929, the month of the Great Depression, says, hey, I'm going to spend $1 million and make a 10,000 acre place, and everyone's going to want to come to it. It's a great plan in theory, right? And on this map here, you got a little drawing from Atlanta, how to get there. You got the Connahaynee Lodge, the Oglethorpe Monument, the second Dude Ranch, although it says Dude Ranch, the golf course, all that up there at 136 where Lake Sequoia is. Next slide. Happens to hire this really cool guy, Janet Vardaman, her grandfather, Professor Eber Carl Perrow, super brilliant guy, Colonel Tate's private surveyor. I'm not going to talk about what this is going to happen with this building, maybe in the future, but he ended up moving to Jasper, ended up working for Colonel Sam Tate, ended up surveying at least 15,000 acres of this county. Next slide, please. Back up on Mount Oglethorpe, part of the Tate Mountain Estates, I think part of the planning even, was the start of the Appalachian Trail used to be there on the top of Mount Oglethorpe. He renamed the mountain from Grassy Knob to Mount Oglethorpe after James Oglethorpe, the founder of the colony. And from 1930 to 1957, the start of the Appalachian Trail was right there. There was a big dedication. The governor of Georgia came out. J.B. Hill was there. A bunch of dignitaries were there. And that's a photo from the day when they had the ceremony in October of that year. Next slide, please. Okay, so So I mentioned the second dude ranch. So in 1930, 1931, 32, there was a dude ranch. The first dude ranch was at the Whittingtons' house located near where the 6 hole is. The fourth lady, I think, in this photo, the one with the tie, the one with the German shepherds running over to her, is a lady by the name of Blink Drummond. Blink Drummond and her dog Pal, that was its name, was the daughter of a cavalryman and the granddaughter of a cavalryman. And she was an expert equestrian. She was a sharpshooter. She was a pistolier. She was a debutante. And she was someone connected in high circles. And Colonel Sam Tate picked her to be the person to run the Dude Ranch. Incidentally, even when she was a kid, when she was like 11 years old, she was known where she lived in La Jolla, California, as being a heck of a horse rider. And she was the first girl west of the Mississippi to ever win the highest award of the Girl Scouts, the Golden Eaglet Award. She was the very first person ever to win that. So she just had one of those interesting lives. I don't know why their movie hasn't been made about her. She's totally awesome, but she was here only for like 2 years. Next slide, please. So there's Blink Drummond there. One of the things she used to like to do is she would take people on horseback rides to Amicalola Falls and back. And then once a week, she would take a horse back to downtown Jasper, check her mail, grab a Coke, that kind of thing. People would come from all over the country, really, to come to this dude ranch. It was called the 3C Ranch at the time. There was an article that was really hard to find because it came out of, I guess it was Knoxville, where it said the 3C Ranch is no place for sissies, was the title of it. And there's this columnist by the name of Ben Cothran who became enamored of Blink here. And he ended up spending so much time at the Dude Ranch in North Georgia, they ended up getting fired from the paper because he kept missing his deadlines and such. It was in the articles. But when he described the Dude Ranch, he said if you were there, if you weren't up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, you weren't going to have breakfast. And if you weren't ready by 7, you were going to miss your horseback ride. And if you weren't in bed by like 5 p.m., you were going to be too tired to miss the next day. He said they had a cook, and they had their own barracks and their own sleeping quarters. And this is all centered around what the Whittingtons had left behind. Next slide, please. So back to Professor Perrow. Now this photo is actually of the professor at his, what I like to call, I think it's right, his mailbox house. I think this is a precursor of the man cave. Okay, he had a house that was way back on his property from this, but this was by the road, so they would deliver mail to this mailbox, and inside this building there was like a seat and a table, and he would write, his correspondence to his friends and his friends at Harvard and his old associates at Louisville and his family members, right? And he would just spend his time there, not all of his time, obviously, because he was busy surveying, but he was also the lead educational supervisor at the CCC camp that Colonel Tate had at the Dude Ranch site in 1933. Next slide, please. So this is the report I pulled out of the National Archives. It's the one inspection report from our CCC camp that we had. And the P in P77 stands for private because it was on private land. And basically there was 200 people that came to the camp here, and they were building fire breaks and fire towers and doing forestry work. And most of the people came out of Fort Benning, and they had a nickname for the camp, which is called Camp Langley, also because Private Langley, who was training with them to go here, he ended up dying when he was at Fort Benning. So they end up naming it Camp Langley informally. Next slide. So Thomas Faircloth, when he was 16, he was one of the people that went to our CCC camp. He's older here. He wrote a bunch about what it was like to live at the CCC camp here in Pickens County. And he basically said that the best part of being in the CCC was going to like a food cook-off in Marble Hill. They'd go to school, they'd ration off at dinner, and the girl would come along. And then the other thing they would do is once a month in the barracks, they would go and get musicians from town, either Jasper or Tate. They'd bring back a musician, they'd have a dance. So, they worked their butts off, and on the weekends, they got to meet people and have fun. Now, Lily Mae Penley will tell you that her older sister, was a looker, and the CCC guys would come over and give her a quarter to get her to sneak her older sister out to go hang out. And she told me that by the end of that year, she had over $20. Now, I know that's not a nice story because it sounds like, but that's just Lily Mae being clever, right? She had to make money too. Anyway, but Thomas Faircloth, I got this photo. I tracked down his granddaughter. And she's like, who are you and why do you know my grandfather was in the CCC in Pickens County? Because they're in Florida. And I said, well, I don't know. I'm just one of those curious people. And she's like, oh, you want to see pictures of him? I'm like, sure. She's like, you want to talk to the rest of my family? So I've been talking to her brother. And anyway, I don't want to get into it, but I got more stuff coming from the CCC camp, but it hasn't arrived yet, but that's in progress. Thomas ended up serving in World War II after serving here. Now, one thing he said, and I haven't been able to verify it, he said there was a guy by the name of Henry Jordan, but his last name is pronounced Jordan, spelled like Jordan, who is affiliated with the Americas group that started Habitat for Humanity. And he was the lead medic at our CCC camp here for the 1 year I was here in 1933 to 1934. Next slide. So this map is impossible to see even for me. But this is actually a hand-drawn map of how basically to get to the Dude Ranch drawn by Professor Perrow. So on the bottom side, you have what used to be Route 1, which is now Bent Tree Drive. You pass a couple of Champions houses, you make your way to the Dude Ranch, you work your way up Mount Hendrix Mountain, past Turkey Gap, and then Turkey Gap is right before you get to Echo Ridge turnoff, for those of you who know. The spring is right there on the corner, and then the rest of it's up on Monument Road and up to Burnt Mountain. That's what he's drawn. He's got some names of the mountains here that I didn't know about. Now, Denny Top is cool because we have a Denny Ridge, right, in Bentry. Denny Top's there, but there's a Round Top, and, I don't see anything on any other maps. There's a Dread Mountain, which sounds really scary, and there's the Devil's Half Acre, and that's a real story that I know about, but that's for a different talk. Next slide, please. So this is an aerial shot from 1954, basically where the Dude Ranch was. Okay, so this is where the Dude Ranch, the Whittingtons were. This is the original road through the area that now is Bentry. This really follows the golf cart path on the golf course, past North Duffer Drive, if you've ever been in Bentry. Little Pine Mountain, which is now a road, goes way off to your right. So the lower right corner by the Arc is where Bentry administration would be today. But this is an aerial shot of the area back from the early 50s. Next slide, please. Appalachian Trail Map. So this is really interesting. The Georgia Appalachian Trail Club produced a book called The Southern Guide to the Appalachians by the Appalachian Trail. And in this book that they have this map of the approach trail to the original Appalachian Trail. So basically you start in Tate, you get off on a train and you make your way pretty much up where High Knoll is today off of Cove, work your way up Route 1, which is now Bentry Drive. You pass the mailbox that says Champion on the left, which is where Rick Jaspers lives today, where Hardy Champion used to live as one of the waymarkers. You make your way to the Dude Ranch, and then you're about, another 5 miles or so 8 miles until you get to Lake Sequoia. But all this path is there, and the Dude Ranch is on this map. Now, I'm really lucky. I got a copy of this book. Unfortunately, they're really expensive because there's so few left. And I've got the map out in my car. I was going to bring it in, but I was running behind. I don't have the rip. That rip is not from my map. That's a picture I found online. But anyway, there's a lot of local history tied up with the Appalachian Trail. Next slide, please. So most of you guys know of Connahaynee Lodge. Do any of you know what Connahaynee means? It's a Cherokee food mixture of rice and beans. Why they named the lodge after a food dish, I'm not sure, but that's really what it is. Connahaynee Lodge, built in 1930, part of the Tate Mountain Estates, originally had about 20 rooms made out of chestnut logs and Indian fieldstone. Beautiful place, marble bathrooms, fixtures, and things like this. A lot of the socialites and well-to-dos from Atlanta, Tate Mountain Estates was the summer colony, basically, of the wealthy elite from Atlanta. And so they would have like fox hunting and other events and, canoe rides and all that kind of stuff. For those of you that are golf fans, Charlie Yates was the big golfer that helped build the golf course up there next to the lodge, well, next to the lake. Charlie Yates was really big friends with Bobby Jones. So if you haven't heard of Charlie, you know Bobby. Bobby played golf up at this course before it went away. But this is the Connahaynee Lodge. The upper right quadrant is a coloring of Lake Sequoia. A lot of locals call it Tate Mountain Lake, I've been told. Is that true? Okay. Next slide. This is a black and white photo of the Connahaynee Lodge. So the whole mountaintop used to be cleared back in the day. So you can imagine what it's like being at like 3,300 feet higher than Mount Oglethorpe. And you're looking down at the valley, kind of back at the Tate Mansion, depending on which direction you look. It's got a way better view than Eagles Rest today, but it's all grown up since then. Next slide. Some of you may have read the article I wrote about Wallace Hughes Jr., who wasn't in the county for very long. He broke out of a chain gang on Grandview Road by the church, Sharp Top Baptist. He fell down when they shot at him, acted like he got hit. So they're like, hey, let's stop shooting at him. Good idea, right? Got up and ran over the hill. Hey, there's no blood. They had a pack of 50 guys and some bloodhounds. They chased him for a week. They tracked him down to the Connahaynee Lodge. That's why he's on this slide. He went to the servants' quarters of the lodge, so they had servants at the lodge back in 1937. Stole some clothes, punched someone in the face, and got away. And they didn't catch him until 3 months later down in Atlanta. That's a whole other story, different presentation. Next slide, please. So the Connahaynee Lodge dining room, you see those interesting chairs there? Well, it turns out in the hour before the fire started and between when it went away, someone salvaged those chairs and took them to Grandview Lake. And I have one of them right here. And you see the back of that. All right, this is one of them. And on the bottom of this is an engraving. It says the Habitat Lodge Company. That was started in Bay City, Michigan in 1923. So it predates the lodge by about 7 years. So I was able to authenticate the chairs. I'm happy to have one. I'm going to donate it. Maybe after the speech. Next slide.
You go and donate to me?
Next slide. All right. So this is a picture of the lodge burning. So 1946, caught on fire in May. The groundskeeper, a guy by the last name of Forrest, was in the basement. He realized that there was some electrical problems going on. It caught fire. By the time he made it to an active phone and being out in the middle of nowhere, it was too late. The logs went up real fast, and that was the end of the lodge. Now the ruins are still there. It's still really neat out there. There's still one of those like 40-foot, 50-foot high chimneys still standing out there. All the field stones still intact. It's a neat place to visit. It's about a 2-mile hike each way. Next slide. So this is an interesting one that I didn't expect to find. 2,500 acres burned near the CCC camp. Reward, Georgia Marble Company, $250. Well, that's a lot of money back in 1935. It says we'll pay $250 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the party or parties who set fire to the woods or near Hendrix, Grassy Knob, or other mountains in that range and caused the burning of woods of these mountains, endangering houses located at the CCC campsite. And the article that accompanied this on the front page said it was like 2,500 acres. This was around December 12th of that year. So lots of the buildings went away right after that. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry. That was the article I was just telling you about. 14 forest fires that week. Next slide. So in their book about the Appalachian Trail history, the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club said they hiked up in pieces this sign for the start of the Appalachian Trail in 4 sections from the abandoned Dude Ranch. So this is 1938, right? So 3 years after that big fire, the Dude Ranch is abandoned, but they still hiked up this sign to have like a way marker at the Appalachian Trail in 4 pieces. That's a long hike before there's roads. That's not a pleasant one either. Next slide. It's hard enough to drive up that mountain. Okay, so why is this slide even in here? George Bush saved by the USS Finback submarine in 1944. We'll get to that later, but it ties into Pickens County. Next slide. I promise. Frank Spratlin gets radio tower, 1947. So Frank Spratlin used to hang out at the Connahaynee Lodge big real estate magnate out of Atlanta. And after the lodge site burns down, he's like, hey, I'm on the board of regents for WGST. Let me see if I can get a radio tower permit. So he gets one and they install a radio tower, and that's still up there, by the way, at least the foundation of it, next to the Connahaynee Lodge. First radio station to broadcast rock and roll music to Atlanta came off of this tower next to the Connahaynee Lodge burn site because he got the permit. Next slide. And there's just a little map showing where the radio tower is. That's right where the lodge site is. That's from a topographical map from around 1978. Next slide. So even though they won't release the census records yet, they will release the census enumeration records. So what does that mean? It means there's maps, and these maps show where all the houses are and roads are at a given time. And so this is the bent tree area. So there's about 12 dots there. So across 3,500 acres, there's about 12 homes. So, people maybe owned a lot of land, or at least didn't have very many neighbors. This is, really pristine area before Bent Tree got started. Next slide. Dude Ranch burns again. Christmas Eve, 1953. Fire destroys house and about 4,000 chickens. So I guess people around there, like Lily Mae, might have smelled chicken for a while. 4,000 chickens go up in a big fire. She told me that her father, Vernie, was a logger, and he lost a lot of logs. And I don't know if it's from the 1935 one, probably, or this one, because other land. But if you read, it says Mr. Anderson, Mr. Evans, Mr. Gordon. Mr. Evans used to rent out, was one of the last people to rent out the Whittington home. So there's a consecutive chain of houses and owners. So I think the house was there, but most of the ranch was gone. Next slide, please. Vantress Chicken Farms. Thank you for this one. So there it is, Vantress Poultry Experimental Farm on Monument Road. Before it was Monument Road, used to be Fire Tower Road back in the day. Why is this here? Because in 1948, America, in association with A&P Grocery and the War Department, had the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. The Chicken of Tomorrow, where they were trying to, breed a more robust, faster to come to market chicken. Well, Charles Vantress won the award. He won the contest for the Chicken of Tomorrow. And he was a California farmer, and he crossbred a California chicken with a New Hampshire chicken and came up with our modern chicken, right? But his idea was if he had it at a high altitude farm, he could test it for other things that you couldn't normally do to see how robust it would be. So for everyone that ever asked me, why would you ever put a chicken farm on Monument Road? It had to do with testing the chickens. That's what the story said in the newspaper. I assume it's true. But when you read about part of the reasons why the Appalachian Trail moved in 1957, turns out there was 40,000 free-range chickens on Monument Road. 150,000 chickens total, 40,000 free-range chickens, and butane tanks. So imagine 150,000 chickens and all that smell, all the butane, all the stuff they leave behind. You're trying to hike. Some logging took down the blazes and the way markers. The Appalachian Monument, Oglethorpe Monument's defaced at this time. There's 50,000 beer cans at the old trail shelter. They're like, I think let's put it at Amicalola Falls, move it to Springer Mountain, right? Next slide, please. This is an actual photo of the chicken farms up off Monument Road. This is just a small section. If you look at the aerial photography from the decades that go through, there's about 3 sections of these. I wrote an article about this, and a guy called me from Monument Road. He lived in one of the subdivisions up there. He said, I have a chicken farm in my backyard. I said, yes, you do. He's like, I didn't know I had a chicken farm in my backyard. I said, well, yes, you do. Anyway, there's still some remains up there is my point. And I think locals, if you talk to them that remember going up there, they used to go up there to hunt, and there were lots of snakes up there and all this kind of stuff that people remember being up near the chicken farms. I don't know anything about that. Next slide.
People used to go up and dig up the ground.
Yeah.
My uncle, for instance, I couldn't tell you how many truckloads we took out of there for fertilizer.
Okay, well, that makes good sense then. Thank you for that. So this is what the Oglethorpe Monument looked like before they moved it. So that's General Oglethorpe's face before Ino redid it. And so people would shoot the monument with guns. They would defecate it on with their horses, really. It was struck with lightning. It was just private property and not maintained well. That's not a dig on anybody, but it's good that they end up moving it and fixing it. Next slide. Roads inside the area, 1958. That's okay. Next slide. Okay. This is a weird story, but so 1968, this guy by the name of Dean Spratlin, that's Frank Spratlin's kid, comes to Tate Mountain Associates and says, hey, I've got this idea and I want to buy 800 acres from you. And I want to build this colony basically that starts where Vantress does today, but ends up by the overlook off of 136. I want to abut your land. And what do you say? And they're like, yeah, we don't know. And he's like, well, I need the county or the state to allow me to reroute the highway through there. And that didn't happen and it fell apart. But he said, I have this great name for this place. And this is before Vantress name. He says, let's call it Hound's Ears. Really? That was the original name of Vantress. Why? I guess because of the golf course. I guess, or the topography. I can't think of another reason. The other name was Beach Mountain, which makes more sense. Sounds a little nicer than Hound's Ears. I don't particularly like either of them, but that's what Dean Spratlin did. Next slide, please. So October 1969, the announcement's kind of made inside the county, inside the progress, that they're going to be building this. At the time, they said a 10,000 acre development, so I guess they were trying to mimic what Colonel Tate had done. It ended up with 3,500 acres, so I'm not really sure about what happened there, but next slide. So H. Dean Spratlin, the reason he partnered with Liberty Corporation, so the Liberty commercials you hear today, the insurance people, they were the financiers of Vantress. Dean Spratlin was the developer, Frank Spratlin's kid. The reason he's here is he was the submarine commander that saved George Bush. USS Finback, 1944, he was the submarine commander. He became lifelong friends with the president. Not just because he saved him, but I'm sure they had something to do with it. Next slide. So this was what Vantress used to look like in the early days. So for those of us who live there now, most of our split rail fences are gone. We used to have split rail fences at the entrance, at Club Tamarack, at the golf course, at the 10th hole. Now we don't really have many. But this is what it was, kind of more rustic than it is today. Next slide. Dude Ranch closing. So there's this article that they had to put out in the paper because when Vantress was being built, they had to give notice that they were going to be closing down a major road. So the Dude Ranch Road, it mentions the land lots. If you go to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm going to go. That's right. Stay there. Basically, it goes from where the Young Life entrance is, where the American Baptist Association camp used to be before Young Life, all the way down, basically through our golf course near the administration, and that was the Dude Ranch Road. But they had to notify everybody. So early on, we had this guy by the name of Dr. Philip Greer. He was an ecologist. Vantress had their own ecologist. So he's the guy that designed the nature trail by the water plant that's now abandoned, where he had 100 placards out in the wilderness that indicated species types. Anyway, I found 3 of the placards, but there's no words on them anymore, so that's not very cool. Anyway, it was really neat that we had one. He also partook of an early archaeological dig that happened in Vantress. So 50 sites were dug up within the land before the development started, and they found 0 pieces of pottery. They found a bunch of old tools and weapons and like quartz shards. So they all determined that all the Indians that lived in Vantress were archaic Indians. They weren't Cherokee. They weren't Creek. They didn't live there. They hunted there. There's some dispute, and there's some people that think that bent tree is named after Indian trees that are bent. Bent tree got his name when Dean Spratlin was driving by Lost Tree in Florida with his secretary, and she said, "Oh, wow, Lost Tree." And he goes, "Oh, I like that name. Let's call it Bent Tree." That's where Bent Tree got its name. I hate to dispel any myths that anyone has about the coolness of the name, but that was out of an interview that Dean Spratlin did. Next slide, please. So this is the Dude Ranch Road. Basically, I just did 3 different maps. There's an aerial map, there's an old land lot map, and then there's a modern satellite photography. That was the length of the old Dude Ranch Road that closed down. Next slide, please. No trespassing, ABA. American Baptist Association had this sign in Vantress till about 3 weeks ago when I took it down. And it was on Vantress property, so I guess the property lines changed a little bit. one of the neighbors in Bentry came out and said, "Hey, what are you doing? That sign's been there since I lived here in 1995. And I said, "Okay, but you know what? It predates Bentry. I'm going to take it anyway, so I have it." I promise I'm not trying to, to do anything. Anyway, this is part of my incidental history collection. Next slide, please. Ancient Indian relics discovered at Bentry. So this is the article that mentions what Dr. Philip Greer did with Robert S. Blakely and Roy S. Dickens. I cannot find any record, even though this collection of artifacts is supposed to be at a local college. No one at the college knows about it. And I contacted the Georgia State Archaeological Office and talked to the president of the file manager, and they don't know about it. So this collection has been lost over time. I tried to get it, but I can't get it. Next slide, please. Yellow Creek tornado. Some of you guys remember this. This was a big deal. This tornado wiped out the old church on Yellow Creek, and I believe it left the pulpit perfectly intact. Is that correct?
Yes. I went there, me and my dad went to church there.
Yes, sir.
Pulpit sitting right there. There was not one slab, one pulpit, the Bible.
Yeah, which was intact too.
And it was open to some story about great storms. Wow. So that was all nice.
See?
Let the truth.
Yes, so yes, sir. So I just wanted to share that with you, which is awesome. Thank you for confirming that. This made national news too. This wasn't just here. Next slide, please. Sharptop arsons, 1978. So arsonists burned down about 800 acres. And if you look on their little map there, which you can't see, they didn't know it was Lake Tamarack, Bentry Lake. Okay, which is okay. They got the idea right. The interesting thing about this story, apart from that the arson happened again, is the next slide, please. Yep, that's the Georgia helicopter from the forestry department that got our water out of our lake to put the fire down. And that's the shot of them taking it out. So I just thought that was a neat one to show you guys, if you haven't seen that yet. Georgia Forestry Department helicopter battles fire near Sharptop, bringing water from Bentry Lake. And next slide, please. That's it. So thank you for listening. I'll take some questions if you guys have any.